morning and thank you for joining us today for our first Webinar Wednesday session of 2017. My name is Katie and I will be moderating this morning and looking after any questions or queries that you may have throughout this morning's session. You can get in touch with us throughout the session. We try to keep it as interactive as possible, so if you've got any questions as we're going along, on the right-hand side of your screen, you've got a little option to type in a question to us. And as I say, what we'll do is we'll try and pick up as many as we go along. If not, we'll look to address them at the end, particularly if we're getting a lot of questions on the same theme. So we'll be picking those up, so feel free to send over anything that you have. Today, your speaker is Kevin Blunden. He's the Technical Director here at CABE. And he's going to be talking us through Part R of the building regulations. So we're looking at the connected home and how to ensure that we're meeting this new legislation that's just been released. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Kevin and he will talk you through this morning's session.
Right, good morning and welcome to this morning's webinar on Part R of the building regulations. First of all, I suppose I ought to address the misnomer of the presentation. To give these things a nice catchy title, we labelled this the connected home, but as those of you who've perhaps already looked at the new Part R to the building regulations will have appreciated, the requirement for connectivity that came in on the 1st of January under regulations actually applies to all properties and not just to domestic dwellings, and it's part of an overall initiative to ensure that properties can receive decent quality connection and internet connections, which, as with a lot of our legislation at the moment, has fallen out of European articles and directives, but obviously forms part of the UK strategy in terms of improving services as well. So we are looking at a brand new regulation, Part R of the building regulations. It's been talked about for a number of years, and obviously one of the main issues with considering whether to bring this into building regulations had previously been that quite clearly infrastructure for electronic communication is not something that sits with the bulk of building regulations, in that it's not primarily something relating to the health and safety of people in and about buildings. But what we have seen in the last few years, and I think we'll see an increase of in the future, is a desire by the government to try and put all regulation that relates to the construction of buildings in one place so that it's easier for designers, developers, contractors to understand what the requirements are without having to look at a lot of different sources, and also to concentrate the enforcement side in one place so that everybody understands the regime and knows what they've actually physically got to do. So there is provision within the Building Act to allow us to deal with things like communication. So we're now introducing, as from January 1st, Part R of the building regulations. And the concept of Part R is that when we carry out work, we are making sure that we've got high speed in building infrastructure for the communications. Now this isn't the bit beyond the property to the cable in the footpath or even the cable in the footpath. This is purely what happens within the property, so that when that connection is laid at a later date, there's the ability to have a decent quality of connection. And when we're looking at work and it's a building containing more than one dwelling, so perhaps something like a block of flats, then we're looking to make sure that there's a common access point that can be connected onto. And one of the other things that we've tended to see in terms of changes to regulations in recent times is to try and make the guidance document and the explanation that goes with these things somewhat easier to understand. And whilst regulations still have to be in a legal framework that can be interpreted and enforced through the courts if needs be, there's an attempt to make some of the wording used slightly simpler. So as far as Regulation R1 is concerned, it applies when we are erecting a building or we're doing a major renovation of a building. And obviously then later within the guidance, it goes towards telling us what a major renovation may be. So, gone the wrong way, sorry about that. Right, so when did it actually come into effect and when does it not apply? We've fairly got used to transitional provisions for legislation over the last few years where we have a cut-off date, and then quite often, as long as work is submitted by that date and started within 12 months, it can carry on to the previous standard. That's not the case with Part R. It's a fairly simple transition. If the application was in whatever form, initial notice submitted, building notice, full plans application, if any of those were in effect before the 1st of January, then Part R does not apply to the scheme. If the schemes come in after the 1st of January, Part R applies to that work. So fairly straightforward in that term. And to be fair, I don't think we've seen a glut of applications come in at the tail end of December to avoid Part R, because I don't think the industry necessarily thinks it's that onerous. So I mentioned that the guidance document would help us in terms of defining major renovation works. And there's still an element that for some things, we still have to look for building control bodies to do an interpretation of what it says in the documentation. So major renovations are described as work at the end user's location, encompassing structural modifications of the entire in-building physical infrastructure. So it's not structural modifications to the building, it's modifications to the structure of the in-building infrastructure, or a significant part of it. And the difficulty with that is there's no clear definition of what constitutes a significant part. So if you are messing with the infrastructure for communications within the building, is 50% a significant part, or is 75% a significant part, or maybe is 20% significant? That decision at the moment isn't defined and therefore is left up to probably building control bodies to interpret as to what is or isn't significant. The in-building physical infrastructure, which is what we're messing with, includes wired or wireless networks if they can deliver electronic communications, and it's talking about the access point and the network termination point. So in other words, the point at which the service provider would connect on to or put the service into the property would be the network termination point, and the access point would be the point at which the building user would draw off that service or plug in their router or whatever. Okay, so what are we actually looking at? And this is where it's a little bit difficult sometimes to understand where we are and to check on standards. We do know that in the UK that we still have massive issues with broadband connections and access speeds, particularly in rural areas. So there is a lot of work still to be done to try and address that. The speed that we're looking to be able to capable of dealing with is 30 bits per second, and if we currently look at what a lot of providers claim to be providing, for most providers, if you go to their more expensive packages, which tend to be fibre optic, they're already claiming that they're providing in excess of that. But there are a lot of places where you can't get the fibre optic connection. I'm sitting here at the moment in the middle of Northampton. I live 15 miles away in a village, which is probably only 3 miles from the next nearest town. But we cannot get fibre optic. So the requirement is, regardless of what's currently available in the highway that could be connected to the property, this is so that in the future, if things improve, then there is the ability to connect. The trouble with all of this technology stuff is there is the very distinct possibility that technology will move on in such a way that in a very quick period of time, this sort of level might actually be well below what we expect to achieve and what's a reasonable amount. So do we have to do this to every single property? Well, the answer to that is no. Sorry about this. The wheel on my mouse is sticking and therefore the slides aren't moving quite forward quite properly. So there are certain properties that we don't have to provide this to. Obviously, if a building is exempt from building regulations, then there's no requirement. If it's an ancient monument, there's no requirement, but I'm not entirely sure we'll be sticking a broadband connection point onto the side of Stonehenge or something of that sort, but there you go. Listed buildings or those in the conservation area where compliance would unacceptably alter the character or appearance. To a certain extent, the visible element of Part R and what the end user is seeing ends up being something like a plastic plate on the wall with a connection point. And given that those plastic plates could be in brass, they could be in metal, they could be in something to blend in with the property, I'm not entirely sure how many times this issue would crop up, unless of course we're talking about major works on an existing property where we'd have to end up chasing in cables into existing construction. The other exempted area is MOD or national security premises, and obviously that's as much to do with the type of connection and the ability to hack in and gain data afterwards. I think where it gets a little bit more controversial is if this whole initiative for Part R is part of the strategy to improve connectivity in things like my village or out in the rural areas where we can't get a reasonable connection, then the next clause or the next get out is a little bit strange, because it's saying buildings in isolated areas where there's not really a prospect of getting a high speed connection and it's considered too remote to justify it, then you don't necessarily have to apply it to that property. Well, I would have thought, to be honest, that's exactly the type of property that we're trying to make sure we're getting a connection to. And I can see an awful lot of debate as to whether you apply it or not based on how isolated you are and how likely it is to get a connection in the future. And then if you're doing renovation works, if the cost of making the provision is disproportionate to the benefit gained, well, that's always going to be a difficult one, because the developer doing a renovation is going to say it's high cost, and obviously the benefit gained is to the end user or owner of the property, and they may well value high-speed connectivity at a lot higher than perhaps the developer would. So if we're trying to say that it's high cost, I think there's going to be an argument there to be had there. And then if it can be demonstrated that there's an alternative means of getting high-speed delivery, then perhaps you wouldn't apply it to the building there. And the only example I can give is something that was being talked about in my locality a little while ago. The next little town along from us actually is the home of a major software and IT equipment provider. And they were at one stage thinking in terms of to put something back in the community to provide free wireless connectivity to everybody by fitting devices to every lamppost in the town, so that nobody had to have their own connection. They just tapped into this wireless network. There have obviously been some logistical issues, and that's not necessarily proceeding. But if that sort of thing were happening, it would be an alternative to maybe doing the connection within the property. Okay, I'm just going to pick up one question there, sort of ties into this main reservation work. Somebody's asked, does Part R to apply to a change of use? It would apply to a change of use if you are making a major renovation to the infrastructure of the property in terms of cabling and data and that sort of thing. So it falls into, it's not the erection of a dwelling, but it's probably a major renovation, and therefore you would argue that Part R applies. So if you change use, you are going to make some sort of data connection provision for each new unit of accommodation, and therefore that's a major renovation and it would apply to it. Okay. So what are we actually looking for then? Well, there's some highly complex diagrams in the approved document which are very similar to the ones on the screen. There's certainly nothing that anybody could write a specification to or actually carry out work. But what we're looking at is a network termination point within the building or the unit, and then a provision for connection from outside from an end user. So the sort of thing we're probably going to end up typically is what we've got in the diagram: a terminal chamber a bit of ductwork ready for connection to an access point, and the network termination point connecting into that. And then if we've got multiple dwellings as blocks of flats, that will reflect throughout the dwellings. Part of the problem with this whole process, though, is really it's very easy to specify. I imagine most drawings will say that in essence, you know, the specification will be such that the in-building communication network will be capable of carrying the correct speed, and the specification side is fairly easy. It's when we get into the issue of what do we actually do in the property, what are we actually going to look at to make sure this is achieved. And I think the problem with that is, in practical terms, what you're going to end up seeing within the property is something very simplistic. So I'm struggling to get the slide to move. There you go. Because what we're not going to see is a whole load of cables and server type connections and spaghetti. Ultimately, what we will probably see on a completed property to decide whether we've got the right level of connectivity or not is the socket in the wall. And the issue with that is going to be, well, if I'm looking at property on completion and I can see the socket in the wall, how do I know if the cabling and the infrastructure behind it is capable of dealing with the speeds that I'm looking for? Because what I won't be able to do is plug in any form of tester device, because at that point in time it won't be connected to a service. It'll be connected and waiting for a service provider that the end user will choose to come and provide the connection or complete the connection all the way back through. So in essence, when doing a completion inspection, we'll be checking that there's a socket there. We might be asking the contractor what they've put in, but we're not going to really know whether the speed's going to work until probably a month after occupation, when complaints start to come through that people aren't getting the broadband speed that they expected to get. So it is a little bit problematic in that form. But on the other side, the reassurance of it, those of you who have high-speed broadband through fibre optic and the like, how many of you, in opting for that high-speed connection, have had to change the cabling within the property to accommodate it? And the general answer is very few. And that really means that the general cabling we use at the moment probably achieves what we're looking for. And there is an argument then, well, what's the point of this regulation if we're already achieving the infrastructure in the building? Why are we actually trying to make sure of that through regulation? It's already common practice, surely. It's just trying to make sure that we don't have a situation that isn't capable. But I would say to you the vast majority of properties that we put together at the moment probably meet this requirement anyway. Right, I'm going to try and pick up on a few more of the bits and pieces, the questions that have come through. Has Regulation 5 and 6 been updated to ensure Regulation R is applicable to a change of use? Not as far as I'm aware, because as I say, the regulation itself includes that provision for major renovations. So if you were to do a change of use and not change the building infrastructure in terms of communications, then it wouldn't apply. It's only when you are making a significant change to that building infrastructure. But as I say, by default, the majority of the time when you're doing a change of use, you will be making a significant change because you'll be changing routing of cables and things of that sort. Does Part R apply to buildings that are not habitable, stores, warehouses, which are not exempt but they're not habitable? It applies to all buildings, but I would think there's a fair argument that if it's building into which people don't go, something like a plant building, maybe not. But even so, if you think about it from a practical point of view, an awful lot of plant buildings nowadays have internet connections so that the plant can be remotely monitored. Would I have to provide broadband to my overly large garden shed? The answer is probably no, and generally non-habitable buildings or buildings buildings where people wouldn't go. I would suggest there's an argument that Part R doesn't have to apply, because ultimately this is connectivity for people. But as I say, you would perhaps have to look at what the client wants to do if it's something like a plant room that's going to have monitoring. And again, it's one of these things, as technology moves forward, more and more things are going to need a degree of connectivity, even though it might not be people related. I was listening to the car radio on the way in this morning talking about, and interestingly, drive time on the way home last night as well, and both programs were talking about how much smarter cars are getting and how much more they're actually connected and doing things whilst they're sat there with nobody in them. And if you think about it, as we move to more sophisticated vehicles, there's the possibility that the car sat in the garage will need its own connection, albeit it might be wireless at that point, so that it can update its software, so that, if we go to automated cars, that the GPS can be updated, and so that it can feed back on performance. So every element in our lives is becoming more and more connected. So as we move forward, I think there will be arguments about all sorts of buildings. It's not clear in the current definitions whether it is only buildings and only people that we're trying to get connected. Does Part R include telephone and internet points, or just internet? It is just talking about high-speed communications, so really just internet. Is it the intention that fibre optic cables be taken up into the boxes at the building, and will the ducts need to include slow bends rather than 90 degrees? Well, at some stage, obviously, there will need to be a connection. On that diagram I showed, let's go back to this previous slide. On that very simplistic diagram, obviously, we've got the service coming in, and then we have a duct provided to bring it up. Yes, obviously, if you're going to get fibre optic, it's going to be an easy bend rather than the sort of 90 degrees at the bottom. Now, it could well be that the developer decides that they're actually going to provide that cable at day one, or that fibre optic at day one, and then it makes it easier later on. But at the moment, it could just be that there is a duct to allow for that later on, because I think there is an element of redundancy in this as well. We're looking at fibre optic at the moment. It may well be that we take another great leap in a few years' time and we actually want something else to be able to bring our connectivity in. Will the terminal chamber be within the curtilage that's being controlled under building regs? If it's outside, then how is it controllable? Well, obviously, you're quite right. Building regulations can only deal with what's within the curtilage of the property. As far as we're concerned, what we're looking at is to making sure that there's the ability that should a service be provided, it can be connected to the access point and the termination point. And there are a number of ways of doing that. So the terminal chamber, actually, if you think about where most of these things sit at the moment, tend to be little boxes in the footpath, so not technically controllable. What we need to be sure of under building regs is that there is a means of being able to get that connection. Okay. Having looked at the regs, I was under the impression that cables were not required to be put into the building, but just the ductwork to accommodate the cables. As far as I've read it and interpreted it, what we're looking for is the infrastructure within the building. So if we look at this sketch, we have the terminal chamber where the service will go to. We'll have the connection from there to the access point. And from there to the network point needs connectivity, so that later on we can connect on. We don't necessarily need within the dwelling several points that we connect to, but you do need at least one point that could be connected to. The whole point of Part R is that when you get high-speed connection, you don't have to start providing cabling through the property to deal with it. So you need a point that you can connect onto, not just simply that I'm going to put cabling in later on. Because clearly, if it was just going to be I'm going to put cabling later on, there'd be no need for the regulation. Okay. And then why is this different from telecoms connection where the cable's to the outside and you get goosenecks in the box on the inside? I don't know, it's just the way it's been devised as presumably as being appropriate for what we're looking at. And then just a comment really, that in some of these rural areas that we're talking about having difficulties with connectivity and connection size, it's interesting to note that Robert's telling me here that in rural Suffolk and Norfolk, you're actually far more likely to be receiving 4G and obviously in the future 5G and beyond that will give connection of 30. And in reality, that's back to that page that was talking about when don't I have to do this. If you can justify it's delivered by some other means, which would be potentially 4G and beyond, then that's probably going to be another way of saying, well, I don't need to do it because I'm receiving it in this way. And it's one of these other elements of where, as technology moves on, the minimum requirement we're looking for in Part R and what we're looking for Part R to achieve will become more and more obsolete to a certain extent. What's the size of the ducting considered suitable? Your guess is as good as mine. The approved document is totally silent on that, so it's just got to be practical, but there is no minimum. Similarly, is there a minimum depth for this ductwork and the like, and the minimum heights of the access points? Well, there's no minimum depths, there's no real dimensional stuff in these diagrams at all. The diagram I put on that's on the screen at the moment, yes, is one we've cobbled together. It's a reflection of what's in the approved document. I just try not to, obviously for copyright reasons, reproduce what's in the document. But there's no dimensional information. There's no real, as I say, there's nothing that would enable you to say, oh yeah, that's a good specification, I'll work to it. In terms of the height of the access point, I think yes, you would take that as a similar sort of consideration as you would with other connections that you do, you know, physical electric plugs and the like, and look at it in relation to Part M. So I would suggest that in terms of height of access points and our connectivity, we would have to look at that zone and height that we do for everything else under Part M. And thank you, Michael, for chipping in with that answer there as well. Right, so similar sort of diagram if we're looking at a block of flats, yeah, not exactly high tech again, having a network terminal point within each dwelling and a common access point. So our connection comes in through the duct to the common access point and then branches off into each dwelling. But again, it may well be that the answer for a block of flats is that it comes into that common access point and then the connectivity from there on is wireless rather than actually physical cabling in the property. So there are other ways of achieving some of these bits and pieces. And the document allows for satellite and wireless technology as another way of meeting the provision. So what we're trying to do at the moment is probably we're trying to bridge the gap while we're still looking at a lot of stuff being hardwired until such point as the technology moves on to a point where it's freely available for everybody to have a satellite or a wireless connection or a 4G or whatever we're going to use. If we want more guidance on the subject beyond what it says in the approved document, there is a publicly available specification, PAS 2016-2010, which was Next Generation Access for New Build Homes as a guide, obviously published by BSI but working with what at the time was the Department for Business Innovation and Skills. And there's a NHBC Foundation research document and guide, the Connected Home, which looks at building the technology into today's new homes. And to a certain extent, some of that in the Connected Home focuses on the other ways of doing it rather than just the cabling options. But as far as approved document R is concerned, that is very much it. It is a very simple document. It only has within it 9 pages, some of which is purely referencing, and realistically it says very, very little. I think the challenging elements in Part R will be over things like interpretation of what is a major renovation, what's a substantial proportion of the work. And I think it is a little bit fraught, because I think it's going to be very, very difficult to actually look at and determine on site whether it's been provided or not. And at the moment, if somebody has an issue with their connectivity, they will moan to their supplier. Going forward, I suspect the supplier will start saying, well, we're providing it perfectly well, it must be an infrastructure problem. And then I can see those householders coming back to building control and saying, well, you haven't done your job properly in terms of getting my connection in there. And I suspect that we may well see that Part R over time starts to push up that speed that we're looking for as well. In the commercial sector, it may well be that a lot of organisations are actually looking for something much better than Part R anyway. Right, okay, a couple more questions. Is there a distance for the termination chamber away from the dwelling? No, not in the guidance. So there's no real guidance on when that termination chamber would be. In actual fact, the subtle difference between the diagram that I've put on the screen for you to look at and the one in the approved document is the one in the approved document doesn't actually show a connection between the terminal chamber and the service duct at the property. It shows a duct at the front of the property. If you like it, what it doesn't necessarily show is the connection all the way through the garden if you chose to put the termination point further away. Fire stopping, presumed necessary in blocks of flats. Obviously, yes, wherever we're putting any form of cabling or service of whatever type through a property, anywhere where it's going through compartmentation lines, and each flat would be its own compartment, it will need adequate fire stopping around any of these pipes. That's just part of normal instance. I mean, to be honest with you, obviously all of these sorts of properties that we're talking about will already have an infrastructure in place. Nobody's going to buy a newly converted or a brand new home that hasn't got some provision for connectivity at the moment. So those sorts of issues should already be being addressed anyway. Just because it's not a controlled service in terms of up until Part R we haven't controlled internet, doesn't mean that we haven't done things like fire stopping round the cabling and the like. So that obviously needs to be done. Right, paragraph 1.2 says provide the in-building physical infrastructure so that in the future copper or fibre optic cables or wireless can deliver the speed. Does this not mean only ducting needs to be installed and not the cables? I take your point, Brian, in terms of do we just need to put some ducts through the property, but ultimately the whole issue is, can we actually connect up to it and have the provision? And the concept of this is nothing should be provided in the building that's going to restrict that connectivity. In real terms, yes, I suppose you could just provide a load of ducts through the property to get to where you're going to connect onto. But if somebody buys a newly converted or a new property and moves in and then rings up, I don't know, Virgin or BT or whatever to get their broadband connection, they're not going to want to hear, oh, well, the first thing you've got to do is actually fix a load of cabling within your property. So although the documentation talks about ducting, and primarily that would be in something like the block of flats and the riser and that sort of thing, in reality it's going to have to be built in. People are not going to accept that you're going to have to retrofit putting cabling in through properties. And then surely one can argue that building control are just ensuring the enabling work and the duct only. Well, that goes back to the point that Brian's just made, and yes, there is an argument for that. But again, how are you going to make sure that's been done? Because you're not, unless you're inspecting every stage of the work. And is there no comeback for building control because there's no guidance on what is suitably sized ducting? I don't think we can take that argument. I think we've got to take the view that, you know, if a duct's been provided and it's not big enough or suitable for the service, then that's not meeting the requirement, and the designer, developer and building control should have ensured that the ductwork was suitable for what's going to be provided. So I don't think you can just say, well, we accepted any old duct, we're not sure that it's going to take the service that we're looking for afterwards. Okay, I mean, I think in reality, this isn't going to make a huge amount of difference. I don't think it's going to be, you know, to a certain extent, groundbreaking. A lot of what we currently do probably works. So in reality, we've just got to make sure that we can get to that minimal level of connectivity. And as I say, an awful lot of the properties we've got at the moment, when you connect up to a high-speed connection, so your provider provides you fibre optic, they are doing that to the termination point, and quite often you don't have to change the infrastructure within the property to get to that higher speed. Therefore, it means that most of what we're using actually meets the requirement anyway. Which cable would you go for, Cat fibre or optic cable, or both in ducting? Choice is up to anybody. As long as we're capable of getting the speed, it would make sense to allow for both, because it allows for a different number of providers, if you like, or a different means of provision. And as I say, there needs to be a degree of flexibility for end choice user as to what they actually want. Okay, and is the duct simply a hole drilled in the wall? Well, you could argue, yes, if you've got the access point on the outside and you drill the hole through the wall, the duct is just that hole through the wall if the network point's going to be on the inside of that. And then, quite rightly, when we're looking at multiple properties, things like blocks of flats, the ductwork, if we're providing ductwork within the property rather than just, will have issues in terms of sound transmission between flats, and there'll be air tightness issues under Part L, there'll be fire issues in relation to penetrating structure. So when the question earlier on asked about the cabling going through fire resistant structure, if you take a block of flats, if we're putting in a duct, then obviously we will have to look at the size of the duct and what we're going to do to maintain that fire resistance should a fire occur. So anything that's a reasonable sized duct to push fibre optics or cables through in the future needs to have provision to make sure that we maintain the fire resistance should there be a fire in the property. As building control, how can you prove this has been installed as an alternative to unscrewing the faceplate to check? I've got to be honest with you, I'm not even sure unscrewing the faceplate would be a way of making sure, because if what you see on the back of that is cable, you've got no idea really just by looking at it as to whether it's capable of achieving it or not. Okay, if we've got a building where it's a shell and then a subsequent fit out, who's responsible? Well, I would say at the shell stage there has to be provision so that you don't then have to do additional work to provide ductwork and light at the fit out stage. But it's the same as a lot of things when it comes to the shell and the fit out. It depends on the sequence of events and who's involved and what's actually going to be provided. So if you're not providing any services at shell stage, then maybe not. But if you're providing connections for electric, water, etc., then I would suggest you do this in exactly the same way. Okay, I think then that's about it. There's just one more question about really the ducting and the chamber. Is it the service provider's responsibility, not building control? As I say, what we're looking at in terms of building control is what's there within the property. So ultimately, the bits outside will be somebody else's responsibility. We need to know whether we've got the ability to connect in the property. All right. Thank you very much then. I think we've covered off all the questions that have come in so far, so thanks very much for taking part. If you've got any questions going forward, obviously come back to us. We will, in the normal way, be posting this webinar on our YouTube channel, and then colleagues, friends will be able to access it there, and if you need to go back and refresh on it, it'll be that there for you to look at. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you for your time this morning and your expertise again, and thank you everybody for joining us and taking the time out of your day. Just so you know, our next online webinar, our next CPD will be on the 15th of February, so another Wednesday morning, 8 AM. And we're looking at flood resistance or flood resilience. So that's the next one that you can join us for. All of the webinars that we are running are available to register onto online. If you just pop onto our website, cbuilding.com/webinars, you can see all the webinars that we will be running. And as Kevin has said, we will be putting this online. It'll be on our YouTube channel later for you to view again and share. So again, thank you for your time, and we will see you next time.